I'm going to continue on talking this series on faith. We're talking today about women of faith. But in Hebrews 11:32, as I was focusing on last week, we started here, and I'm going to quote from the Amplified Version here in verse 32. And what shall I say further? Okay, yeah, there's more one can say. And here the biblical writer is saying, after he'd been going here for 31 verses, he's probably saying, and what can I say further? For time would fail me, probably ink too and parchment, to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by the help of faith subdued kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promised blessings, closed the mouth of lions, extinguished the power of raging fire, escaped the devourings of the sword. Out of frailty and weakness won strength and became stalwart, even mighty and resistless in battle, routing the alien host. Yes, well, if you missed last week's sermon, you should check out on cogwebcast on our archives, and you should catch up with what is going. For anybody who's new or who has been away for a bit or missed it, check it out. There's some very interesting things here in this series that we're doing on faith. Now, last week in my sermon, I did repeat and give you the amplified explanation of faith that is first defined here and defined for us in the New Covenant in Hebrews 11:1. Okay, if you turn with me to we were in Hebrews, just go back to the beginning of this chapter, Hebrews 11 verse 1. Now, faith is the reality. As I said, the word here in Greek is hypostasis. It's a legitimate claim. Faith is the reality. Faith is the legitimate claim or the title deed. That's amazing to think about. Faith is the reality, the legitimate claim, the title deed of what is hoped for. Here the Hebrew word is alpizo. What is hoped for? This means it's not just a sentiment or feeling, but the Greek makes it very clear that it's what we're actively waiting for. We are actively waiting for our hope. We're in action. We're active. So faith is the reality of what is hoped for. It is the proof, as in the Greek word is here is enkos. It is the proof, it is the inner conviction, okay, that's what the word is meaning, the inner conviction, the internal persuasion that comes from God. So faith is the reality of what is hoped for. It is the proof of what is not seen, I also cited, let's go to Galatians 5:6, let's take a look at this. Galatians 5:6. The centrality of what faith means to us as Christians. The Apostle Paul explained here in Galatians 5:6, again staying with the Amplified. For if we are in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith activated and energized and expressed and working through love. It is faith that is activated, energized, expressed, and working through love. It's not just an acknowledgement or something that we confess. It's something that's moving through us and moving in us. Why is circumcision or uncircumcision, why is this sort of an irrelevant thing? Well, the whole thing is, circumcision was it was a community thing. Traditionally, it was done by parents of a baby boy who was only 8 days old. Well, what does that count, really, when you think about it, towards God's salvation? They're only 8 days old when they're circumcised. No, it was a sign that they belonged to a community that was going to depend on this, that was going to rely on this. That's what circumcision was all about, that you were taking seriously the promises and the covenants of promise that were given to Abraham and through Moses, that you were going to actually live these things, that you were going to be taught these things, that you'd have a background. But it was just a little sign of admission to a group of people who said they were studying the Bible, were following the words of God. But when it came down to an individual, you know, whether it was cut or whether it was not cut, okay, for the boy babies and, of course, for girls, for women, well, it was an irrelevant question, you know, that they were part of the community just because their men or their boys were circumcised. From that standpoint, it was an irrelevant thing. You know, it counted, you know, from God's sight, really, in the bottom line for nothing. What is counting is that faith that is activated, that faith that is energized, that faith that is expressed, that faith that is working through love. Yeah, there's that word, working through love. Okay, there we are. That's what it means. Yes, faith that's active. The Greek word here was energizio, I believe, if I remember that correctly. You know, last week I showed this kind of faith that was active and that was working, that was energized in Daniel and his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and all the things that they went through as captives by the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar. You know, if again, as I said, if you miss this, you should turn into COG Webcast. It's on the archives. It's right there. Well, today, as it is Mother's Day weekend, I wanted to, you know, continue on this series, but I wanted to focus on one particular verse here in Hebrews 11, and that's verse 35. Hebrews 11 and verse 35. You turn with me to Hebrews 11 and verse 35. Actually, we'll pick this up again, maybe, and we'll start here in 32. Let's see, Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11. Now what more can I say? For the time would fail me to relate the accounts of Gideon, Barak, and also of Samson and Jephthah, David also, and of Samuel and the prophets, who by faith were victorious over kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were strengthened from weaknesses, became mighty in war, turned back the armies of foreigners. Verse 35. Verse 35. Women received their dead, restored to life, is the way the Coulter renders it, or as the Amplified Version, some women received again their dead by a resurrection. The Holman Christian Standard Bible says here, verse 35, women received their dead. They were raised to life again. This is a remarkable, remarkable thing, an incredible miracle from the hands of God. It was women. You know, it was saying it wasn't men, by the way. It's saying, the scripture says, some women received their dead. The women received their dead. They were raised to life again. God preserved these accounts for us in the Bible. They are remarkable stories. They involved women. You know, the status of women in the ancient world was, without a doubt, very low. You know, it was low indeed. Yeah, you know, in some things, in this modern world, we've changed the status of women in certain countries in some places. But as we'll see, you know, I'll talk about in a little bit, it's actually fairly low in a great part of this world, even to this day. I want to show this a little bit to you here about the status of women and what it was like in the ancient world here. And I want to point something out here. Let's go to Genesis chapter 38, and how God works and how God's mind thinks. Genesis 38, verse 1. We'll start here in just beginning. And it came to pass at that time that Judah left his brothers. This is Judah, the son of Jacob, or of Israel, okay? He left his brothers and went to a certain Adullamite named Hirah. Okay, this fellow, he was a good acquaintance of his. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite man named Shua, and he took her and went into her. Okay, Judah was a man, and he didn't have a wife at this point in time, and he was visiting one of his friends, and he saw this woman, and he was impressed. Anyways, he took her to him as wife, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. And she conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. And she was at Kezib, when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. So we're talking about in the course of time, he had his eldest son, and he found a wife for her, and her name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. You know, it didn't matter that he was circumcised. He was wicked in his heart, and the Lord killed him. And Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and marry her, and raise up offspring to your brother." You see, when a woman came into a family, her job, her mission was to build up that family. And really, once she came into the family, she wasn't to go out elsewhere. She became, in many ways, the property of that family. And that was her life. That was going to be her duty. That was what they were looking at. And Onan knew that the offspring, when he would go into Tamar, would not be his. No, the offspring legally weren't going to be his. In other words, the offspring would receive from Dad, from Judah, their portion of the inheritance of the firstborn. It wouldn't go to Onan. He was selfish. He saw this. He was selfish. And it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife, he was going to do what Dad told him to do. He went into his brother. He spilled his seed on the ground, not giving offspring to his brother. So he masturbated and spilled his semen on the ground. And he wasn't going to do what was the proper thing to raise up seed for his brother in his brother's stead and his brother's inheritance. No, he wanted it all for himself. And what he did was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Yeah, because he did not love his brother, his neighbor, as himself. Therefore, he killed him also. Yeah, so here was Onan. Yeah, he was circumcised. There's no doubt about that, Judah would have had him circumcised. But his heart wasn't right. He didn't have faith. He didn't have faith in the teachings of God. Here many years that were, you saw that some of the teachings of God are consistent, even long before they were codified by Moses, many years later. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow at your father's house until Shelah, my son, is grown." Yeah, she wasn't free to do whatever she wanted to and to do whatever she chose. That wasn't the ancient world. You can see that very clearly. She had to do what her father-in-law told her to do. She was part of the family. If you want to say, she's bought and paid for. In those days, you did have to pay a bride price and all that sort of thing. And that's still done in many parts of the world, by the way, to this day. To this day, a large part of humanity, this is still a going thing, all right, even in the 21st century. So he said, remain a widow in your father's house, okay, stay home with your dad and your mom, okay, but, you're a widow. You're bound to us. You can't go out and marry somebody else or do something else. No, you don't have that option. Until Shelah, my son, is grown. Okay, and the idea was here, well, Shelah will fulfill what, in raising up seed, raising up children, raising up inheritors in his brother's stead. To build up the family, to take the place of these who died early. But Judah, when he's told that to Tamar, he wasn't being frank or sincere. Now, he gave her that line. Shelah was probably young. Okay, he was probably young. He's probably still a boy at that point in time, or a very young teen. For he said, this is Judah said, lest perhaps also, as his brothers did. Okay, lest he die. Lest perhaps he die as also his brothers did. So, Judah's starting to get the idea maybe Tamar is bad luck. Maybe Tamar is bad news, okay? I give my third son to this woman, and he's going to end up a croaker too. Judah's a little worried about this. I mean, there's a precedent that's going on here, and he was sort of putting it on to Tamar from that point, rather than looking at the fact that God hadn't been happy with He hadn't been happy with Onan. No, he wasn't. They were not men of faith. And in verse 12, and the days were many, and Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. Okay, so a long period of time is passing. Years are passing here. And Judah was comforted and went up unto the shearers of her sheep, he and his friend Hirah of Adullam, to Timnah. And it was told to Tamar, saying, Behold, your father-in-law goes up to Timnah to shear his sheep. Okay, Judah's wife is dead. Time had gone by because they didn't just get over their grief. You're talking about a grieving process. They did it the full way of what they expected of human beings in those days. And verse 14, Tamar is seeing, she realized, something, that she's been stiffed. Okay, she realized that for the rest of her life, she's going to be a widow. She isn't going to have a family. She isn't going to have a future. She can't just go out and marry anybody else. It just doesn't happen. She's part of this family of Judah. Verse 14, and she put off her widow's clothes and covered herself with a veil. Okay, widow's clothes. They had a specific style, just like you see in Europe when you go over in Europe and the southern European countries particularly. I remember when I was a young man and I was over there going to school, and you'd see it, whether it was Spain or Portugal or Italy or Greece, it was black. These black clothes with, dark stockings and a black headscarf. Not very attractive. And that was the point. They dressed that way because they were dead, as far as being, living life to the full. It wasn't going to happen for these women. Anyway, she put off her widow's clothes and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself. Put on her most interesting clothes. And you ladies know what I'm talking about, okay? The clothes that will attract the attention of a man. Oh yeah, women know all about this. Which is by the road to Timnah. And she sat in an open place. She went down to where Judah would be walking by, which is by the road of Timnah. She had good intel. All right. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as wife. She knew, she knew her future was zero, okay, at this point in time. Verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot because she had covered her face. Because, of course, to be a harlot was a certain dishonor. It was disrepute, and it was a shameful thing, even in the ancient world. Now, I know these days, some people find that hard to believe because here in Canada in particular, they're trying to make prostitution, just another career choice for women and girls. They're trying to pass laws that's just fine. I mean, prostitution is legal anyways, but they want to do the whole conduct of prostitution to be legal. That's where we're at in our society. Yeah, that's where we are here in the 21st. We're so advanced. Verse 16, and he went over to her. Yeah, Judah saw her, said, this looks good, It's been a long time since I've seen such a nice woman. And he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me come in to you. Okay, catch the language, the poetic form of how they did it. And it's literal in many ways. And he said, come now, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law, because she had the veil. And she said, what will you give me so that you may come into me? Any woman who's doing this knows she's got to get the bargain up front. You get the bargain up front, not afterwards, okay? Verse 17, and he said, I will send a kid of the flocks, of the goats from the flock. And she said, will you give me a pledge until you send it? Okay, sir, your word isn't good enough. I want some security here, bud. Which would have been sort of a normal thing. Judah wasn't put off by that. Verse 18, and he said, what pledge shall I give you? And she said, your signet and your bracelet and your staff that is in your hand. Your signet, talking about your signet ring. This was the thing that had when you would sign a contract or something like this in the ancient world, usually in clay to buy something or to show your possession of something. They'd have the clay and you'd stamp it, okay? So it was that this was yours. It belonged to you. And your bracelet, all the stuff was custom made, okay? It wasn't put out by a factory. It would have been distinctive along with the staff. Only would have been one of a kind. only one of a kind. She says, and what the pledge, your signet she wanted, and your bracelet, and your staff that is in your hand. She's actually asking for a lot, not just one. She's asking for 3 things. I mean, this was, sure identification, if you want to put it. This was your passport, your social security card, and your health care card, if you want to put it that way. I mean, that's what she was asking for. It was from a big deal. Maybe, wasn't a credit card, though. And he gave it to her and came into her. Okay, all right. He came into her. It'd been a long time since he had a woman. And she conceived by him. Judah wasn't a young guy, but he was still quite fertile. Verse 19, and she arose and went away and laid away her veil from her and put on the clothes of her widowhood. Verse 20, and Judah sent the kid of the goats by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand. But he didn't find her. Then he asked the men of the place, saying, where is the harlot who is by the roadside? And they said, there was no harlot here. And he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. And also the men of the place said, there was no harlot here. And Judah was feeling at this point in time that he'd been scammed. Because I'm sure his signet ring would have been gold. His bracelet most certainly would have been of heavy silver, sterling silver, and then his staff, it would have, all that stuff was worth far more than the kid of the goats. And Judah said, let her keep the things as her own, lest we be despised. It wasn't something he wanted to just pursue and publicly announce. Behold, I sent this kid, and you have not found her. Okay, I did my part. I did what I was, I fulfilled my pledge. I'm fine with that. Okay, let's let it go. Verse 24, and it came to pass about 3 months afterwards, it was told to Judah, saying, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. See, she was Judah's property, the property of the family of Judah. She wasn't free to go out and do whatever she wanted. Not like today. People do all sorts of things. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Okay, extra crispy. Okay, that was the solution for this. Okay, what was the status of women? You cross the line, burn her at the stake, as it were. When she was brought out, verse 25, she sent a message to her father-in-law, saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please observe whose things these are, the signet and bracelets and staff. It would have been like, it would have been kind of like this big moment. And Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to my son Shelah. He never knew her again. And of course, from this point, the Bible goes on to talk about that the child that was born, the children actually that were born of Judah and Tamar at this point, were Pharez and Zerah, who would be very prominent. Their descendants are going to figure very prominently in the story of the Bible. But God preserves this. It's a fascinating story, and you see here very clearly this woman, Tamar, what her position was. She was being shafted. Okay, but God had a way of resolving this. God had a way of resolving this. But going back again to Hebrews 11:35, some women receive their dead by a resurrection. Now that you can see a little bit about where women were in the ancient world, we want to take a look at this. God was very concerned about the status of women. It was something that was something that he took a big interest in. In antiquity, if you go to Exodus chapter 22, chapter 22, right after the giving, when God himself stood on top of Mount Sinai and gave the 10 Commandments, what followed, of course, were expositions, the fine points of that law. Okay, he gave the summary. Okay, the 10 Commandments are merely the summary of what God had in mind. God began explaining to this people in much more detail of what this meant, of what the 10 Commandments really meant. Okay, Many Christians tend to think these days, your standard run-of-the-mill Christian tends to think, well, I just look at the Ten Commandments, I've done that. But they don't look at the rest. They don't see some of the way how God breaks it down and examine themselves of whether they are involved in fulfilling the will of God by looking at the detail that God gives. Although, it's set in a time of antiquity, but if these things apply, when they apply, they apply. Anyways, in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 22, God made a specific point immediately after the giving of the Ten Commandments of Mount Sinai. He said to the children of Israel through Moses, he said, "You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your sons fatherless." Oh, boy. He's putting it in an ancient, the way he put it was like, what goes around comes around. You treat these people incorrectly. You treat these widows who have no big status, okay? They can't stand up against you. You start taking their land and their inheritance and oppressing them in this, that, and the other way because, they can't fight back. They don't have the standing to stand, in courts the same way. Well, I'm here, and I will deal with you. Let's go to Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy chapter 10. A lot of people feel the God of the Bible was someone different, quite a different personage than Jesus Christ. Well, they're absolutely wrong. Those of you who are listeners of COG webcast and have been listening to me for a while know that this is not the case. He is the God of the New Covenant as well as the God of the Old Covenant. Same God, actually. In Deuteronomy, chapter 10 and verse 12, Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 12, now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Israel, you the chosen people of God, and we in the church of God are the Israel of God, okay, too. We're in here. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Okay, you're really to do it. And from the innermost part of your being, you are to love God. Verse 13, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you today for your good. Yeah, God's commandments and his statutes are for our good. They're not a sign of punishment given to the Jews, as a lot of apostate Christians would sometimes put forward in how they look upon God's commandments and his statutes. No, God gave them to his people, to the Israel of God, for their good. Verse 14, behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth also, and all that is in it. In other words, God owns you too. God owns you too. Okay? Just like Judah owned Tamar, God owns us. Verse 15, only the Lord had a delight in your fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, you above all people as it is today. Therefore, circumcise what? Just your penises? No, he said, therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be no more stiff-necked. It's been the same problem from the beginning, isn't it? Circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be no more stiff-necked. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, a great God, the mighty and awesome God, who does not respect persons. He doesn't care what your status is. He doesn't care if you're a big poobah or, whatever it might be. He doesn't respect the rich or whether you're poor. He does not respect persons nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and widow, and loves the stranger in giving him food and clothing. Yeah, those on the bottom of the totem pole, here in British Columbia, we have, a lot of totem poles because we live in, an area where you have a lot of Northwest Aboriginals. And on the bottom is the symbol of the people who had the least status. They're on the bottom, and everybody is stacked up on top, and you really see who's on the bottom of the totem pole. Wow. He's saying execute justice for the widow. Deuteronomy, we won't turn there. Deuteronomy 14:29, God included very clearly, he included third tithe rights for widows. And in Deuteronomy 24:19, he included economic ways for them to glean, to go into the fields, the agricultural produce, so they'll have a way of sustaining themselves with food and oil. So he gave the people all those things so that they could be supported, all the widows, so that they wouldn't starve to death, so they wouldn't be completely marginalized in society, that they'd have some sort of hope. As we talk today, as we're talking right now, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people from Syria who fled Syria because of the civil war that's going on there, and a great number of them have crossed over into the country of Jordan. I think they announced just this week that 10% of the population now are these refugees, and it's due to increase. They have a figure of maybe up to 40% over the next few years if this civil war keeps going, and they're desperate. The UN aid agencies don't have enough money to take care of all these people as it is right now. So you're finding many a desperate Syrian war widow, whether her husband whether she knows he's dead or whether he's just off fighting in Syria right now against the regime of Assad. Anyways, they're in Jordan and they are in desperate financial situations. And they had an account in the paper about this one woman who had she had a young son, and she was having to buy milk and didn't have the money to buy milk for this young child, and it was desperately, and they didn't have the food to eat. So she decided that there was only one thing to do. She's going to have to join an increasing trend among these people and marry off her daughter, who is 16 or a little bit younger, to wealthy Persian Gulf Arabs who are coming up there and are telling, the various matchmakers, yeah, I'll have a bride for a week. I want blue eyes or green eyes, because a lot of the Syrian women have blue or green eyes, and they'll pay you $2,000. You can pass on. I'll give you $100 or $200 for arranging this. And so they sign the papers, and he has her for a week, and then he signs the divorce papers, and off they go. And this is perfectly fine in Islam. This is how they're doing it. This is the aid, This is how it's going. This is what's going on. You even look in this Western world, who are the most impoverished people in our society right now? Isn't it the single moms? Aren't they on the bottom of the totem pole? You better believe it is. And their children are filled the prisons. You go in the prisons and you talk to these men. Most of them grew up in households with the father was not present. I know. Those are the statistics. Those are the facts. Being a widow, being a single mom, if you want to put it in our modern language in some respects, it's always been a bottom of the barrel in a difficult situation. Well, the scripture says here, and as I said, as we said, some women receive their dead by a resurrection here in Hebrews 11. Let's go to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 17. We'll go to 1 Kings. This is in the former prophets. This is where it's listed, in the original order. It wasn't part of the writings. It's actually placed right, before 2 Kings, obviously, but before the major prophets, Isaiah. Anyways, 1 Kings, because it is a prophecy. It was a prophecy of sorts. 1 Kings 17, and we'll go here. We'll start with verse 1. Beginning of the ministry of Elijah, the prophet. Elijah the Tishbite, the sojourners of Gilead, said to Ahab, who was one of the worst rulers of his time, a man who had forsaken God's ways, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except according to my word." This was climate change in a big way. God was going to send them a drought because he was very unhappy in the sort of apostasy that the leader of his nation was leading his people into. Sort of like the leaders of our nations right now are leading their whole nations into apostasy away from the living God. That's going on right now too. Verse 2, and the word of the Lord came to him, saying, go away from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith before Jordan. And it shall be, you shall drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. And he went and did according to the word of the Lord, for he went and lived by the brook Cherith before Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and flesh in the morning, and bread and flesh in the evening, and he drank of the brook. And it came to pass after a while, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Things were getting really dry and hard. And the word of the Lord came to him, saying, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there. Behold, I have commanded a widow to keep you there. And he arose and went to Zarephath, and came in to the entrance of the city. Okay, entrance of the ancient cities was always where this big public space where business would be done, where people would meet, and this sort of thing. To the entrance of the city, and behold, the widow was gathering sticks. And he, that's Elijah, called to her and said, please bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink. Remember, water's precious. And she was going to bring it. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. And she said, as the Lord your God lives. Okay, because she could see he was an Israelite by the way he dressed. People had their national costumes. And you notice here that as she's speaking to them, as the Lord your God lives, okay, she wasn't doubting God's existence like so many people today. I do not have a cake, but only a handful of meal in a pitcher and a little oil in a jar. Now see, I am gathering 2 sticks so that I may go in and dress it for me and my son so that we may eat and die. What she's saying is that we're at the end of the road. We've got this, we're going to eat this and then we're starving. We've already been starving for a long time, but that's it. We're dead. And Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go. Do as you have said, but first make me a little cake and bring it to me. And then make for you and for your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the pitcher of meal shall not be emptied, nor shall the jar of oil fail, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth. It was a test of faith. Elijah was testing the widow of Zarephath's faith. Would she have the faith to make, what seemed like the last of her, the last morsel of food and give it to this man, the stranger from Israel? Verse 15, let's see what she did. And she went and did according to the saying of Elijah. She had faith. She had faith that was active. She acted on the faith. She fulfilled the request. And she and he and her house ate many days. And the pitcher of meal was not consumed, and the jar of oil did not fail, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Elisha. I don't know, brethren. Right now we're living in an illusion in North America. We're living in an illusion. Times could come when times will be very, very hard, harder than anything that you or I have experienced in this life. It may be that we'll have to have faith one day, that, the bottom of the barrel that God will provide. Not abundantly so that others would see to want to steal or take away, but just that we live day by day. It's just, give us thy daily bread. Here is an actual living example, history of someone, the widow of Zarephath, living for her daily, day by day by her daily bread, asking, believing, having faith. Verse 17, and it came to pass that after these things, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, fell sick. And his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. In other words, he died. And she said to Elisha, what do I have to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to call my sin to remembrance and to kill my son? Was she a single mom, never really married to her, the fellow who had been, sort of her husband? We don't know with the story. But she's speaking out of the anguish of her heart. Her son, her only son. She had no other man. This was her future. She had no other. What was her source of support in the future? This was her social security and her bank account and everything else. This was her hope for the future. Died. And Elijah said to her, "Give me your son." And she took him out of her bosom, and he carried him up into a loft, where he stayed, and laid him upon his own bed. You see, he was actually dwelling with her. He was, he was dwelling in a part of the house. And he cried to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, you also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourned by slaying her son. Have you? Have you brought this evil upon her?" And he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, please let this child's life come to him again." And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he lived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down out of the room into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." And the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." The word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. Let's go to the Gospel of John. Let's turn here just with me to the Gospel of John. Let's go to John chapter 3, and verse 2. John chapter 3, verse 2. Nicodemus made this confession to Jesus Christ. He came to Jesus by night because he was afraid of, people seeing him come to Jesus. He came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, because no one is able to do the miracles that you are doing unless God is with him." That was the proof of the prophet. That's what this widow of Zarephath confessed. She knew that Elijah was a man of God because of that. Further, let's turn here to the Gospel of Luke. And let's go to Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. And verse 24. Luke 4 and verse 24. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his own country." Elijah wasn't. Jesus wasn't acceptable in Judah. Elijah wasn't acceptable in Israel. Kings were out after them. "For in truth I say to you, many widows were in the land of Israel in the days of Elisha, when the heavens were shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine upon all the land. And Elisha was not sent to any of them, but only to a widow in Zarephath, a city of Sidonia," what we would call modern-day Lebanon. She was a Gentile. This was a fascinating thing, something, again, that was preserved in Scripture a number of points, to show people that God is looking upon the heart. He's looking for those who have living faith, those whose faith is active. Let's see another point of where the women receive their dead back to life. Let's go to 2 Kings now. Let's go to 2 Kings. Again, one of the former prophets. So that's what they're called. It's given in prophecy for us, not just history books. 2 Kings chapter 4, and we'll start here in verse 1. 2 Kings 4 and in verse 1. "A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, saying," now Elisha was the successor to Elijah, handpicked by him, saying, your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord. And the lender has come to take my 2 children to himself for slaves. So here was a man who was faithful, who was a believer, and yet he had died and left his wife a widow and 2 orphans, 2 young sons. And of course, it's just like as Jesus would later recount the thing where somebody had debts and they were going to come and take him as slave. Well, this was going to happen to her and to her children. And what was her future? Her husband was dead and her 2 sons would be taken as slaves. She'd have no future. She'd have very little way to support herself because they weren't following the laws of God. They weren't allowing them to go out in the fields and do the gleaning. They didn't, this was during the time when Israel was going astray from God. And Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your handmaid has not a thing in the house except a pot of oil. And she was probably pretty close to the truth. Just a pot of oil, she said. That's all I've got. And he said to her, go borrow vessels for yourself from your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not let them be few. And you shall go in and shut the door upon you and your sons, and you shall pour out oil into all these vessels, and you shall set aside the full ones. And she went from him and shut the door upon herself and upon her sons, and they brought vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not a vessel left. And the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go, sell the oil, and pay your debt, and you and your sons shall live on the rest. He provided her a pension. He provided her a pension, a way to survive, and a way for her sons to be able to raise her sons. Verse 8. And the day came when Elisha passed over to Shunam. Shunam was part of the land of Israel that had been promised to the tribe of Issachar. And a wealthy woman was there, and she persuaded him to eat bread. And whenever he passed by that way, he turned in there to eat bread. And she said to her husband, behold now, I see that this is a holy man of God who passes by us continually. Please let us make a small room in the upper chamber, and let us set a bed for him there, and a table, and a stool, and a lampstand, and whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. Now the day came when he came there, and he turned into the room and lay there. Wow, this was really nice. I mean, she was taking care of the man of God. She was taking care of someone who was teaching and bringing the word of God to people. She was using of her substance to do this. She was giving. And she was perceptive. And he said to Gehazi, Elisha said to Gehazi, his servant, call the Shunamite. And he called her, and she stood before him. And he said to him, that is, Elisha wasn't speaking directly to the woman. He was speaking to Gehazi. So it's sort of like this little fiction was going on. It's just like a translator, you have somebody who your foreign king, has somebody in there, and the translator's doing the back and forth, so he'd speak to the translator, but, even though they know what's going on, but it was protocol. A man like Elisha couldn't speak directly to the woman at that time. And he said to her, now speak to her, and say, behold, you have been thoughtful for us with all this care. What is to be done for you? Do you want me to speak to the king or the commander of the army? Yes, Elisha had a great deal of influence with the king that was ruling in the army at that point in time. He had connections. And she answered, I dwell with my own people. In other words, I don't need anything, from this standpoint. I've got everything I need. And he said to her, Elisha said, what then is to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, truly, she has no child, and her husband is old. This means that there's going to be trouble in the near future. She has no child to take care of her, no son. She has a husband who's getting old and will die. What's going to happen to her? She's going to lose everything she has, possibly. And he said, call her. And he called her, and she stood in the door. And he said, "At this time, according to this time of life, you shall embrace a son." And she said, "No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your handmaid." I mean, obviously she had tried. She and her husband had tried for children for many years, and they were infertile. They didn't have any children. Verse 17, but what happened? So the woman conceived and bore a son at the time that Elisha had said to her, according to the time of life. And the boy grew, and the day came that he went out to his father to the reapers. Okay, so this would have been harvest season, hot and dry. And he said to his father, my head, my head." He probably had sunstroke or heat stroke. And she said to a servant, "Carry him to his mother." And they carried him and brought him to his mother, and he sat on her knees until noon and died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door upon him and went out. She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, so that I may run to the man of God and return again." Says one of the young men he's going to have a stick, and he's going to switch the donkey's rear end, so they'll go faster. And she's going to be on it, okay? And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." And she said, "It is well." Okay, don't ask. And she saddled the donkey and said to the servant, "Drive and go forward. Do not hold back your riding for me unless I tell you." And she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. And it came to pass, when the man of God saw her afar off, he said to Gehazi his servant, "Behold, the Shunamite. Please run now to meet her and say to her, 'Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the boy?' And she answered, 'Well.'" Okay, she just, it's kind of like we all do. "How's everything going?" "Oh, fine." Verse 27, she came to the man of God to the hill and caught him by the feet. Realize he's a prophet of God, important man in the kingdom, and she's a woman. She's touching him. She caught him by the feet, and Gehazi came near to push her away. And the man of God said, "Let her alone, for her soul is troubled within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." She said, "Did I desire a son from my Lord? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" Elijah understood immediately what she was getting at. And he said to Gehazi, "Bind up your loins and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet any man, do not greet him. If any greet you, do not answer him again, and lay my staff upon the face of the child." And the mother of the child said, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." And he arose and followed her. And Gehazi passed on before them and laid the staff upon the face of the child, but there was no voice nor hearing. And he turned back to meet them and told him, saying, "The boy has not awakened." And Elisha had come to the home, and behold, the boy was dead and laid out upon his bed. And he went in and shut the door upon the two of them and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay upon the boy and put his mouth upon his mouth and his eyes upon his eyes and his hands upon his hands. And he stretched himself upon the boy, and the flesh of the boy became warm. You know how somebody's dead, how they're cold. And he returned and walked into the house. And he returned and walked in the house to and fro. He was pacing. Elijah was pacing. And he went up and stretched himself upon him. Then the boy sneezed 7 times, and the boy opened his eyes, and he called Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunamite." And he called her, and she came in to him. And he said, "Take up your son." And she went in and fell at his feet and bowed to the ground and took up her son and went out. Took up her son and went out. Let's go to Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew. And let's go to chapter 28. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28. And let's go verse 1. Now late on the Sabbath, as the first day of the Sabbath was drawing near. On the day of the Sabbath, now late on the Sabbath, as the first day of the weeks was drawing near. Young's Literal Translation takes this first verse and says, on the eve of the Sabbath, at the dawn towards the first of the Sabbaths, came Mary the Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. What it's talking about, of course, is after Jesus' crucifixion, is that Sunday was the first of after that Sabbath. That was where you would count. The following day was the wave sheaf. It was the beginning of the count towards the Feast of Weeks. It was the beginning of the count towards the Feast of Weeks, which was, of course, Pentecost, which is next weekend. Anyways, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to observe the sepulchre. Verse 2, and in the morning suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone from the door and sat upon it. Now his appearance was as lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him those who were keeping guard trembled and became as dead men. But the angel answered and said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know who you are seeking, Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen. As he has said, come, see the place where the Lord himself is lying, and go quickly and tell the disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he goes before you into Galilee, and you shall see him. Listen, I have told you. And they left quickly the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell it to his disciples. But as they were going to tell his disciples, all at once Jesus himself met them, saying, hail. And they came to him and held his feet, like the Shunamite woman held Elisha's feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go tell my brethren to go into Galilee, and they shall see me. You know, the fascinating thing is, of course, is that the first people to see Jesus resurrected from the dead were the women. And the women received back their dead alive, resurrected. Jesus did this. He did this for women. You know, he didn't give that privilege to any of the disciples. No, some women received their loved ones back from the dead, and they loved him. Exemplified say, some women received again their dead by resurrection. He did this because these women had faith. Now, faith is the reality. It is a legitimate claim, the title deed to what is hoped for, what we're actively waiting for. It is the proof, the inner conviction, the internal persuasion from God of what is not seen. Next week, we're going to hear about Pentecost and those things that await us in the future.